After my wife died, I began volunteering at a medical center every night, just to escape the silence of my empty house. The same rideshare driver always took me home, and I always brought him a black coffee. One night, he drove straight past my street, locked the doors, and told me not to go home. He said my family was waiting for me. What he showed me next completely shattered my reality. If you are just starting to hear this story, now take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is something I never imagined could happen to me. Please hit the like button to support my channel, subscribe so you do not miss my upcoming life stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from. It makes me really happy to know who is listening to me. My name is Richard Stanton. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, and the founder of a commercial real estate firm in Chicago. For over 4 decades, I poured my sweat into building an empire. I started with nothing and eventually built a net worth of $45 million. But 8 months ago, my world stopped spinning. My beautiful wife, Carolyn, passed away. Losing her was a blow I could not recover from. The massive suburban estate we built together suddenly felt like a tomb. To cope with the grief, I started volunteering for late-night shifts at a local medical center. It gave me a purpose and a way to avoid the loneliness of my own home. My routine became predictable. Every single night at 11, my shift would end. I would walk out of the bright lobby and order a ride home. Almost every single night, the app assigned me the same driver. His name was Malik Carter. He was a quiet man, 45 years old, a former military veteran driving the night shift to put his kids through college. Over the months, we developed a quiet understanding. Knowing he worked long hours, I started a tradition. Before I walked out of the hospital doors, I would always stop at the cafeteria and buy 2 large black coffees, one for me and one for Malik. It was a simple gesture of gratitude. Tonight was supposed to be no different. The Chicago wind was bitterly cold, biting through my thick wool coat as I stood on the sidewalk holding the 2 steaming paper cups. The familiar black SUV pulled up to the curb exactly at 11:10. I opened the rear door and slid onto the leather seat, letting out a tired sigh. The heater was already running, wrapping me in a comforting warmth. I settled in and reached forward to hand Malik his coffee, just exactly like I had done 100 times before. But something was completely wrong. Malik did not reach back to take the cup. His hands remained tightly gripped around the steering wheel. His knuckles were totally white. He was staring intently into the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning the dark street behind us. I asked him if everything was all right. He did not answer. Instead, the heavy thud of the central locking system echoed through the cabin. He had locked all the doors. My heart skipped a beat. Before I could ask another question, Malik slammed his foot on the gas pedal. The heavy SUV surged forward with a sudden violent jolt, throwing me back against the seat. Hot coffee splashed over the rim of the cup and burned my hand, but the physical pain was overshadowed by a sudden rush of adrenaline. I demanded to know what he was doing. Malik remained completely silent, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He took a sharp right turn, totally ignoring the route the navigation app was suggesting. He was driving fast, far faster than the speed limit allowed, weaving through the late-night traffic with a focused intensity that terrified me. I am not a man who gets intimidated easily. You do not build a $45 million real estate empire in Chicago by being timid. I am used to being in complete control. I am absolutely not used to insubordination, especially not from someone I hired. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low growl. I told him to pull the car over immediately, or I would call the police. I reached into my pocket for my cell phone, my hands trembling with anger, but Malik simply shook his head. He looked at me through the rearview mirror, and the expression in his eyes was not malicious. It was desperate. He told me to put the phone away. He said the police could not help me right now because the police would not believe me. I did not understand what he meant. My mind raced through a dozen terrible scenarios. Was I being kidnapped? Was this a ransom attempt? People knew who I was. They knew about my wealth. I braced myself ready to fight if I had to, despite my age. We were approaching my neighborhood, the upscale gated community, where my massive estate was located. The street lamps illuminated the familiar stone walls and manicured lawns. I ordered him to turn into my driveway. I pointed at the iron gates approaching on the left. But Malik did not slow down. He accelerated right past my street, leaving my house behind in the darkness. I yelled at him to stop. I told him he was crossing a very dangerous line. He drove for another 2 miles in complete silence, putting distance between us and my neighborhood. Finally, he pulled into an abandoned, unlit parking lot behind an old shopping plaza. The area was completely deserted. There were no streetlights, no passing cars, just a heavy, suffocating darkness. Malik threw the car into park and immediately turned off the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was absolutely deafening. He reached out and clicked off the headlights, plunging us into total blackness. I demanded answers. My voice echoed loudly in the quiet car. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to explain himself before I broke the window and triggered the emergency alarm on my phone. Malik slowly turned around in his seat to face me. The ambient light from the distant street illuminated the grim, deadly serious expression on his face. He looked at me with a profound sense of pity that made my blood run completely cold. He spoke in a low, steady whisper. He said, "Do not go home tonight, Mr. Stanton. You simply cannot go back to that house." I asked him why. My breath caught in my throat as I nervously waited for his answer. Malik looked me dead in the eye and delivered a chilling warning that changed my life forever. He said, "Because your son and your daughter-in-law are waiting for you right now, and what they are planning to do to you tonight is far worse than death." I sat frozen, unable to process the absolute nightmare that was about to unfold before my eyes. The silence in the vehicle felt heavy enough to crush my chest. My mind struggled to process what Malik had just said. For a fleeting second, I wondered if this was some kind of elaborate extortion plot. I am a wealthy man after all. People have tried to take advantage of me before. I gripped the door handle instinctively, looking for a way out, but the central locking mechanism held firm. I turned to him, my voice shaking with a mixture of profound shock and rising fury. I told him he was out of his mind. I demanded that he unlock the doors right now, or I would smash the window and scream until someone called the police. I told him he had no right to hold me here and spout paranoid nonsense about my own flesh and blood. My son is my only remaining family. I warned him that he was committing a felony. Malik did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or try to physically restrain me in any way. He simply kept his hands clearly visible, resting them on the steering wheel, and looked at me with that same unwavering, sorrowful gaze. He spoke in a measured, steady tone, the voice of a man who had seen real combat and knew exactly how to handle panic. He told me he was not trying to hurt me, and he definitely did not want my money. He explained that besides his night shifts at the hospital, he routinely drives the busy afternoon routes through the upscale suburban neighborhoods, including the exact street where my private estate is located. He said he had been watching the unusual activity around my property for the past 2 weeks. He slowly reached over to the passenger side, deliberately telegraphing his movements so I would not feel threatened. He opened the glove compartment and pulled out a sleek, modified laptop. It looked military-grade, incredibly tough and utilitarian. He opened the screen, casting a pale blue glow across our faces in the pitch-black cabin. He then reached up to his windshield, carefully removed the small memory card from his high-definition dashcam, and inserted it directly into the laptop. As the operating system booted up, my heart hammered violently against my ribs. A cold sweat formed on the back of my neck. I desperately tried to rationalize what I was about to see. My first logical thought was that Malik had captured footage of dangerous burglars casing my property. My estate sits on 3 acres of prime real estate. It is massive, heavily secluded, and filled with valuable art and expensive antiques. It would absolutely be a prime target for organized thieves. I desperately clung to that theory. I needed it to be burglars. Because the alternative, the horrifying scenario Malik had just suggested, was simply impossible for a grieving father to swallow. Since Carolyn passed away, my son Tyler had been my solid rock. Tyler and his wife Stephanie had actually packed up their luxurious downtown condominium and moved into the east wing of my estate just a month ago. Tyler explicitly told me he could not bear the thought of me rattling around that huge house completely alone with my profound grief. He said he wanted to be there to take care of me in my old age, to effectively manage the daily stress of the household, so I could focus entirely on my emotional healing and my evening volunteer work. Stephanie had been overwhelmingly attentive. She cooked my daily meals carefully, organized my new medical prescriptions, and directly managed the cleaning staff. I had genuinely believed their continuous presence was a beautiful, selfless gesture, born of pure, unconditional familial love. I had felt so incredibly lucky to have a devoted son who would willingly sacrifice his own independence to support his mourning father. The mere thought that they were planning something sinister was a direct violation of every precious memory, every financial sacrifice I had ever made to give Tyler a perfect life. I stared blankly at the buffering circle on the laptop screen, silently praying that Malik was simply a paranoid driver who had completely misunderstood a mundane family situation. My breathing grew incredibly shallow. The pale blue light illuminated the dashboard, casting long, eerie shadows across the dark interior of the vehicle. Malik typed a few rapid commands, and the video player quickly opened on the bright screen. He paused the footage at the very beginning and looked over at me one last time. He quietly warned me that what I was about to see could never be unseen. He asked me to physically and mentally prepare myself for the terrible truth. I swallowed the hard lump forming in my throat and nodded slowly. He gently pressed the play button. The high-definition footage was crystal clear, captured in broad daylight, just a few short hours earlier. It clearly showed the grand wrought iron gates of my private estate. The precise camera perspective indicated Malik had been parked directly across the street, quietly facing my property, likely waiting for a scheduled passenger. The digital timestamp, glowing in the bottom right corner, read 3:45 in the sunny afternoon. I leaned in closer, my tired eyes straining to carefully make out the background details. The main gates were securely closed, but standing just outside them on the paved driveway were two incredibly familiar figures. It was Tyler and Stephanie. They were completely unaware that they were being secretly recorded from across the quiet street. The raw footage had no audio yet, but their aggressive body language spoke volumes. They were absolutely not acting like a loving, devoted couple, enjoying a peaceful, quiet afternoon at their family home. They were pacing rapidly back and forth with a frantic, highly nervous energy. Tyler was aggressively chewing on his thumbnail, his face drawn incredibly tight with a dark, heavy scowl. He kept constantly checking his expensive gold watch, looking anxiously up and down the empty street, as if eagerly expecting someone or something to suddenly arrive at any given second. Stephanie stood a few feet away from him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, smoking a thin cigarette with rapid, jerky, impatient drags. She looked absolutely furious. Every few moments, she would turn and gesture sharply toward the main house, her face twisted in an ugly look of absolute, unmistakable disgust. I helplessly watched my only son, the little boy I had proudly raised, the man I fully trusted with my entire life, pacing nervously, like a trapped wild animal outside the beautiful home I had painstakingly built for our family. My chest tightened as I watched Stephanie toss her cigarette onto the pristine driveway and crush it under the heel of her shoe. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket, dialed a specific number with aggressive, trembling fingers, and brought it to her ear. She began speaking rapidly, her face a mask of pure, unfiltered hostility. I sat paralyzed in the dark car, staring at the screen, as Malik reached over and adjusted the volume dial to amplify the completely isolated digital audio track. The static filled the freezing vehicle as Malik adjusted the sound settings on his modified laptop. He tapped a series of keys, clearing the ambient street noise from the digital recording, deliberately pulling the isolated vocal track to the forefront of the speakers. I sat completely frozen in the passenger seat, my eyes glued to the glowing screen, desperately hoping that whatever I was about to hear would make sense of this terrifying madness. I deeply wanted them to be discussing a simple argument over household finances, a stressful day at the firm, or perhaps planning a surprise family gathering. But the exact moment Stephanie's voice broke through the quiet confines of the vehicle, the very last shred of my naive hope vanished into the cold night. Her tone was shockingly sharp, laced with an impatient, venomous edge that I had never heard her use before. She always spoke to me with such practiced sweetness, constantly ensuring my meals were perfectly hot and my room was immaculately clean. Now standing on my own paved driveway, she sounded like a ruthless predator, frustrated by a delayed kill. She crossed her arms over her chest, blowing a thick plume of gray smoke into the afternoon air, and turned her piercing gaze toward my son. She demanded to know if the morning routine had been handled properly. She asked him directly if the liquid drops were securely put into the old man's morning coffee. My stomach plummeted into an endless, dark abyss. The drops. She was talking about my morning coffee. The premium coffee she lovingly brewed for me every single morning since my beautiful Carolyn passed away. Tyler ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, looking utterly exhausted and deeply agitated by the conversation. He nodded weakly, constantly pacing in a tight circle near the towering wrought iron gate. The high-definition audio caught the heavy, weary sigh that escaped his lips before he finally spoke. He quickly confirmed that he had personally mixed the required dosage into my ceramic cup, just as she had instructed him to do. He swore that he stood right there and watched me drink every last drop before I headed up to my private study. But then his voice unexpectedly cracked, revealing a pathetic layer of mounting frustration and building panic. He complained bitterly that the chosen dosage was taking entirely too long to take full effect on my system. He whined that I was still far too alert, still asking way too many coherent questions about the estate contractors working in the basement, and still managing my daily evening walks without collapsing. He anxiously told his wife that they desperately needed to increase the liquid amount immediately, because the constant waiting was actively destroying his nerves. The profound impact of hearing my own blood actively plot against me hit my aging body with a devastating physical force. I literally gasped for air in the dark cabin, instinctively clutching my chest as a sharp, agonizing pain radiated rapidly through my ribs. It felt as though a jagged blade was actively twisting deep into my vulnerable heart. My son. My only son. The innocent boy I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle on that very driveway, the young man whose college tuition I had proudly paid in full. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting back a sudden wave of blinding tears as precious memories flooded my racing mind. I remembered Carolyn, my beautiful, kind-hearted Carolyn, smiling so brightly on the sunny day of Tyler's university graduation. I clearly remembered how she used to lovingly cup his face in her hands and proudly call him our golden boy. She always genuinely believed he hung the moon and the stars. She believed he was the perfect culmination of all our decades of hard work and endless, exhausting sacrifice. If she were alive today to see this glowing screen, to hear the raw venom in his voice as he casually discussed drugging his heavily grieving father, it would have instantly killed her on the spot. I slowly opened my eyes, compelling myself to stare directly at the harsh reality illuminating the dark vehicle. The cherished golden boy was entirely gone. In his place proudly stood a weak, desperate stranger who was actively poisoning the very man who gave him life and provided his wealth. I watched Tyler nervously bite his fingernail, whining about his mounting crypto debts and the urgent need to secure the capital before his ruthless creditors completely lost their patience. He was actively drowning in massive financial liabilities, and I was clearly not his loving father anymore. I was simply a highly lucrative obstacle standing squarely in his selfish way. I was a $45 million pinata, and he was desperately trying to crack me open without drawing the attention of the authorities. Stephanie scoffed loudly at his panicked whining. She confidently stepped closer to him, her flawless expression completely devoid of any human empathy or basic moral decency. She reached out and firmly grabbed his trembling shoulders forcefully, making him stop pacing and look her directly in the eyes. Her voice dropped to a cold, calculated whisper that sent horrifying shivers sliding down my spine. She told him to stop acting like a pathetic coward and stay entirely focused on their ultimate financial objective. She reminded him that they had already come way too far to simply back out or make a careless mistake now. The slow, methodical approach was absolutely necessary to effectively avoid any unwanted suspicion from my expensive estate lawyers or the nosy, observant neighbors. She explained that the steady daily chemical doses were slowly eroding my cognitive functions exactly as she had planned, brilliantly creating a thoroughly documented medical history of rapid mental decline that absolutely no judge or investigator would ever think to question. It was a flawless, virtually invisible crime executed right under my own nose, cleverly disguised as the ultimate selfless act of familial devotion. I sat frozen in the silent vehicle, gripping the leather armrest so tightly that my old knuckles fiercely ached. Malik reached over and gently handed me a small bottle of water, but I completely ignored his gesture. I could not look away from the glowing screen. I needed to witness every single second of their disgusting treachery. I needed the burning anger to completely burn away the heavy grief so I could properly prepare for the inevitable war. On the vivid screen, Stephanie released his shoulders and took a slow drag. She turned her head meticulously, scanning the quiet street to ensure no one was watching them. In a chilling coincidence of positioning her dark eyes locked onto the hidden camera lens, securely mounted in Malik's parked vehicle. For a terrifying, surreal second, it genuinely looked as though she were staring straight through the digital screen, piercing the heavy darkness of the parking lot and looking directly into my shattered soul. Her mouth curled into a victorious smirk. She flicked her cigarette ash onto the pavement. She said, "We need the final power of attorney signed by Friday. We have to do it before he loses his mind completely." The raw finality of that sentence hung in the stale air of the vehicle. My lungs felt paralyzed. I stared at the frozen frame of my son's wife on the laptop screen, her cruel smirk permanently etched into the digital pixels. Malik reached over and softly closed the laptop, plunging us back into the comforting, heavy darkness of the isolated parking lot. He did not say a single word. He simply gave me the silent space I desperately needed to process the catastrophic collapse of my entire reality. I pressed my trembling hands firmly against my face, taking slow, deep breaths to physically suppress the overwhelming panic that threatened to completely consume me. I am a rational man. My entire professional life was meticulously built on solid logic, undeniable facts, and structural integrity. I could not allow raw emotion to blind me now. I needed to dissect this horrifying revelation exactly like a compromised architectural blueprint. I forced my racing mind to systematically rewind, carefully analyzing every seemingly innocent interaction from the immediate past. I focused on the last 2 weeks. The terrifying clarity began to brutally strip away the sweet illusions I had been eagerly swallowing. They had been treating me like absolute royalty. Every single morning without fail, my son and my daughter Rachel would bring me a lavish breakfast in bed. They would present me with a beautiful silver tray loaded with fresh fruit, warm pastries, and of course that large ceramic cup of premium dark roast coffee. Tyler would sit on the edge of my mattress, pat my shoulder, and softly tell me to rest my weary bones. He would say that I had worked hard my entire life, that I had successfully provided for all of them, and now it was their turn to spoil me. Rachel would kiss my cheek, her sweet perfume masking the venomous betrayal she was actively participating in. She would fluff my pillows and remind me to drink every last drop of my coffee while it was still hot. I had foolishly accepted these gestures as profound evidence of a loving family rallying around a broken, grieving patriarch. I was so blinded by the agonizing sorrow of losing my wife that I eagerly drank the poison they handed me, mistaking their calculated dosage for filial affection. I willingly consumed the very chemicals designed to slowly erase my memories, my sharp intellect, and my fundamental independence, the suffocating pieces of the puzzle continued to slide into place. I clearly remembered the constant, heavy construction noises that had been loudly echoing from beneath the main floor for the past 14 days. The relentless drilling, the heavy hammering, the unmistakable sound of thick concrete being violently demolished. When the disruptive noise had first started, I had walked toward the basement stairs to investigate, my natural curiosity as an experienced builder instinctively kicking in. But Rachel had intercepted me in the main hallway. She had wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, pulling me into a warm, deeply affectionate hug. She playfully scolded me for trying to ruin my own surprise. With a bright, innocent smile, she claimed they were secretly building a luxury home theater and a state-of-the-art, safely padded mini-gym down there. She said they wanted to create a comfortable, secure space to keep me physically active and thoroughly entertained during the long, difficult winter months of my intense grief. She vividly described the plush reclining chairs, the surround sound speakers, and the soft, forgiving floor mats where I could safely stretch my aging joints without any risk of a dangerous fall. She painted a beautiful, touching picture of family movie nights and healthy routines. I had hugged her back, feeling tears of pure gratitude well up in my eyes. I had blindly praised her thoughtfulness and promised to stay completely out of their way until the grand reveal. Sitting in the freezing car, the engineer inside me finally woke up from its drug-induced slumber. The analytical part of my brain, the part that had successfully managed massive commercial developments across the city of Chicago, began to relentlessly scrutinize the structural changes I had so carelessly ignored. I thought about the specific construction crew they had hired. I had briefly seen them unloading heavy materials from the front driveway earlier in the week. I suddenly realized that the large commercial van they drove was entirely unmarked. There was no company name proudly painted on the side panels, no visible phone number, no contractor licensing details displayed on the bumper. In my professional experience, highly reputable luxury remodeling companies always advertise their branding. They want the wealthy neighbors to see exactly who is performing the expensive custom work. But this specific crew moved like silent ghosts, quickly and quietly shuffling heavy equipment into the house through the discreet side entrance. Furthermore, the distinct acoustic vibrations echoing through the floorboards did not match the typical installation profile of residential drywall or basic acoustic paneling. The deep, heavy resonance I had felt in my feet suggested they were anchoring thick, solid steel brackets directly into the foundational concrete walls. You do not need industrial-grade steel anchoring simply to hang a projector screen or install a padded exercise mat. My breathing grew dangerously shallow as my mind rapidly assembled the final horrifying details. I vividly remembered standing by the kitchen window just 3 days ago, slowly sipping my heavily spiked coffee, sleepily watching the unmarked van being unloaded in the driveway. 2 burly, completely silent workers had been struggling to carry a massive, incredibly heavy object up the driveway. At the time, through my drug-clouded vision, I had blindly assumed it was some sort of custom theater equipment, or perhaps a large reinforced media cabinet. But as the searing truth finally burned away the lingering chemical fog, my structural engineering background provided the exact, terrifying identification of that specific object, destroying the last fragment of my remaining hope. It was a solid steel commercial-grade security door, the heavy-duty kind utilized in high-security bank vaults, psychiatric containment facilities, and subterranean panic rooms. It featured a thick, reinforced steel frame, multiple heavy deadbolt locking mechanisms securely positioned on the exterior, and absolutely no internal handle. It was expressly designed to keep whatever was inside securely trapped behind inches of impenetrable metal. The cold, sickening realization violently slammed into my chest, stealing the very breath from my lungs. Rachel had cheerfully promised me a safe, padded room where I could not fall and hurt myself. But they were not building a luxury home theater or a comfortable gym to help me heal from my profound grief. I stared out the passenger window into the endless, suffocating darkness of the deserted parking lot. my heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs as the absolute truth finally settled in. That heavy steel door I saw being carried down the stairs was not meant for my entertainment. It was a heavily reinforced lockdown security door, designed specifically to completely seal a dark, permanent, inescapable prison cell that they were meticulously preparing for me right inside my very own home. The sheer horror of that revelation washed over me in freezing waves. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the passenger window, desperately trying to steady my erratic breathing. As my mind raced to process the dark reality of that heavy steel door, another terrifying piece of the puzzle violently snapped into place. I closed my eyes tightly and allowed myself to analyze the last few weeks of my life without the blinding filter of a father's love. I had been experiencing a sudden, frightening physical decline that defied all logic. It started incredibly subtly, just a slight, barely noticeable tremor in my hands during my morning routine. A strange, heavy fog settling stubbornly over my thoughts by mid-afternoon, making it difficult to concentrate on simple tasks. But soon the alarming symptoms escalated into something entirely unmanageable. I began suffering from severe bouts of dizzy spells that would violently strike out of nowhere. The room would spin, forcing me to grip the expensive wallpaper in the hallway just to keep my balance and prevent a fall. My vision would unexpectedly blur at the edges, turning the grand corridors of my estate into confusing mazes where I felt completely lost. I had always possessed a razor-sharp intellect. As a structural engineer and a commercial developer, my brain was my most valuable asset. I could effortlessly recall complex architectural blueprints from decades ago and run massive financial calculations in my head without missing a single digit. But lately, my short-term memory had begun to slip away in terrifying, unpredictable chunks. I would walk into my private study to review a commercial lease agreement and completely forget why I was standing in front of my own desk. I would lose my train of thought right in the middle of a sentence, staring blankly at my business associates until the silence became unbearable. The most frightening incident happened 4 days ago. I needed to access my primary wall safe to retrieve a routine tax document for my accountant. I strode confidently into the study, stood directly in front of the secure dial, stared blankly at the polished metal keypad, and suddenly realized my mind was an empty void. The 6-digit numerical passcode I used flawlessly every single day for the past decade was miraculously gone. It was completely erased from my brain, as if someone had wiped a chalkboard clean. I panicked instantly. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I pressed my shaking hands against the heavy steel of the safe, desperately begging my mind to simply remember. Tyler walked into the study right at that exact moment. I clearly remembered turning to look at my son with genuine terror burning in my eyes, openly confessing that my brilliant mind was rapidly failing me. Instead of immediately suggesting we drive straight to a trusted neurologist or demanding we visit the emergency room at the finest hospital in Chicago, Tyler gently guided me to a plush leather armchair. He spoke in a soothing, calm voice, firmly insisting that the immense trauma of suddenly losing Carolyn was finally catching up with my aging body. He repeatedly told me that traditional hospitals were cold, stressful environments that would only aggravate my delicate emotional condition. He promised me with a warm smile that he would handle everything privately. He swore he wanted to protect my immense dignity from the prying eyes of the public. He expertly convinced me that I needed discreet, specialized care delivered right there in the comfortable safety of my own beautiful home. The next morning, Tyler proved true to his word and personally brought a private physician directly into my living room. He enthusiastically introduced him as Dr. Harrison, confidently claiming the man was a highly sought-after specialist in geriatric cognitive decline, who strictly handled only the most elite clients in the city. Dr. Harrison was a tall, impeccably groomed, smooth-talking man, wearing an expensive, tailored suit and projecting a deeply calming, rehearsed bedside manner. He did not conduct any standard blood tests. He did not order a comprehensive MRI or even request a simple brain scan to rule out a stroke or a tumor. He merely sat politely on my expensive velvet sofa, asked me a rapid series of remarkably basic memory questions, and watched me quietly struggle to recall the current date. After less than 20 minutes of this casual, utterly superficial observation, Dr. Harrison delivered a devastating diagnosis. He looked deeply into my eyes with an expression of profound, beautifully manufactured sympathy, and firmly declared that I was suffering from early onset, aggressively advancing, grief-induced dementia. He confidently explained that the profound emotional shock of my wife passing away had triggered a rapid deterioration of my delicate neurological pathways. He then smoothly opened his sleek leather medical bag and handed Tyler a collection of dark amber bottles. He told my son these were highly specialized custom compounded liquid supplements formulated specifically for my unique condition. He solemnly promised that these premium vitamins would slow the cruel progression of the debilitating disease and deeply soothe my frayed, exhausted nerves. Tyler administered those liquid drops into my meals and morning beverages every single day since that medical visit. Sitting frozen in the dark cabin of the SUV, the sickening truth broke completely through the manufactured chemical fog in my weary brain. The highly specialized vitamins Dr. Harrison prescribed were not therapeutic supplements. They were the exact liquid drops Stephanie impatiently complained about in the hidden dashcam video. They were deliberately poisoning my mind under the perfect disguise of exclusive private medical care. My hands began to shake uncontrollably as I reached deep into the inner breast pocket of my heavy dark wool winter coat. My trembling fingers brushed against the smooth, cold plastic of the small cylindrical bottle. Tyler had lovingly placed it securely in my coat pocket right before I left the estate for my volunteer shift, reminding me to take my evening dose if I started feeling overly anxious at the busy medical center. I slowly pulled the small amber bottle out of my pocket. The exterior label was completely blank, entirely devoid of any standard pharmacy branding dosage instructions or list of chemical ingredients. I stared blankly at the dark, mysterious liquid sloshing quietly inside the cheap plastic container. Malik immediately noticed my violently trembling hands. He reached slowly across the wide center console and gently took the unlabeled bottle directly from my rigid grip. He held it up high toward the dim, yellowish ambient light, filtering steadily through the dirty windshield from the distant street lamps. He firmly unscrewed the child-proof plastic cap and carefully sniffed the dark liquid inside. His extensive military background had exposed him to countless chemical substances and dangerous narcotics in the field. Malik slowly turned his head to look directly at me, his strong face turning incredibly pale in the deep surrounding shadows. He told me in a hushed, terrified whisper that this was absolutely not a health vitamin. He securely tightened the cap back onto the bottle and stated with absolute unwavering certainty that the mysterious liquid inside was a severe, highly restricted mind-altering tranquilizer. He explained it was a powerful synthetic chemical utilized exclusively in psychiatric lockdown wards to deliberately and permanently induce total cognitive failure. The heavy silence in the vehicle became absolutely suffocating as Malik meticulously started the engine and slowly pulled out of the dark parking lot. I held the small amber bottle tightly in my trembling hand, feeling the smooth, cold plastic pressing against my palm. Total cognitive failure. Those terrifying words echoed relentlessly inside my head, bouncing against the fragile walls of my shattered reality. They were not simply trying to steal my money. They were actively trying to completely erase my mind, trapping me inside a decaying physical shell while they casually drained my lifetime of hard work. Malik navigated the desolate suburban streets with the practiced caution of a military veteran, deliberately avoiding the main boulevards and the well-lit intersections. He understood, without me having to speak a single word, that we needed to vanish into the shadows. We drove for what felt like an eternity, crossing the invisible boundary that separated my exclusive, manicured neighborhood from the forgotten industrial outskirts of the city. He eventually guided the heavy vehicle off the main road and pulled into the cracked, weed-infested parking lot of a dilapidated off-the-grid motel. It was a miserable, forgotten place. The flickering neon vacancy sign buzzed with a low, erratic hum, casting a sickly pink glow across the peeling paint of the exterior walls. There were no security cameras, no digital registries, and absolutely no questions asked. Malik quietly paid the tired clerk with cash from his own pocket, securing a room at the far end of the gloomy corridor. He walked me to the flimsy wooden door, gently pushing it open to reveal a cramped space smelling faintly of stale smoke and heavy industrial bleach. He told me to lock the deadbolt and to try to get some rest. I nodded silently, stepping into the grim sanctuary. I heard the lock click firmly behind me. I stood perfectly still in the center of the cramped motel room, completely ignoring the sagging mattress and the water-stained ceiling. I stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror above the small plastic sink. The man looking back at me seemed incredibly old, frail, and utterly defeated. But beneath the profound layer of overwhelming grief, a familiar, hardened resolve began to slowly awaken. The deeply ingrained survival instincts that had allowed me to successfully navigate the cutthroat world of Chicago commercial real estate were violently snapping back to life. My analytical mind began to systematically calculate my tactical position. My immediate burning instinct was to march straight back to my sprawling estate, kick down the heavy mahogany doors, and fiercely confront my treacherous son and his ruthless wife. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to throw them out into the freezing street with absolutely nothing. But I quickly forced myself to suppress that raw, emotional impulse. Confronting them tonight would be a catastrophic, irreversible mistake. I possessed no concrete legal proof of their dark conspiracy. I only had a short, ambiguous dashcam video capturing a vague conversation on a driveway and an unlabeled plastic bottle filled with a mysterious chemical liquid. If I called the authorities right now, Tyler and Stephanie would simply play the roles of the deeply concerned, loving caretakers. They would sadly show the police the false medical diagnosis provided by their corrupt private physician. They would convincingly argue that my wild accusations of poisoning and secret basement prisons were simply the tragic, paranoid delusions of a grieving old man rapidly losing his mind to dementia. The police would look at my erratic behavior, review the fabricated medical records, and gently escort me right back into their waiting, poisonous arms. They would use my desperate outcry as the final absolute proof of my mental incompetence. I would be permanently trapped. I realized with a chilling clarity that I had to completely suppress my burning rage. I had to beat them at their own sick game. To survive this nightmare, I needed to buy time. I had to convince them that their malicious plan was working perfectly, that I was completely unaware of the deadly trap closing around me. I walked over to the edge of the stained mattress and sat down heavily, pulling my cell phone from my coat pocket. The bright screen illuminated the dark, depressing room. I opened my text message thread with Tyler. My thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard, trembling slightly, as I tried to carefully construct the perfect, believable lie. I needed to explain my sudden absence tonight without raising a single red flag. I forced myself to adopt the pathetic persona they had meticulously crafted for me. I typed the words, slowly making sure the tone was appropriately fragile and apologetic. I wrote that I had felt incredibly dizzy and confused after my volunteer shift at the medical center ended. I explained that I did not want to risk a dangerous fall or cause a terrible accident on the icy roads by trying to drive myself home. I concluded the message by stating I had decided to safely sleep in the hospital on call room for the night and that I would see them both tomorrow morning. I stared at the short block of text for a long, agonizing minute. It felt physically repulsive to send those words to willingly engage in this twisted psychological warfare with my own child. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the send button. The small swoosh sound of the departing message echoed loudly in the quiet room. Now the absolute worst part began. The waiting. I placed the phone on the scratched wooden nightstand and stared at it intensely. I mentally braced myself for a wave of aggressive hostility. I fully expected Tyler to be furious that I had deviated from his strict routine. I anticipated a frantic, demanding phone call, insisting that I return immediately so he could monitor my condition. Every passing second felt like a heavy, suffocating hour. The silence in the motel room stretched out thick and unbearable, amplifying the frantic beating of my heart. Suddenly, the bright screen on the scratched wooden nightstand brilliantly illuminated the dark corner of the small room. A crisp, sharp notification chime violently broke the heavy silence. My stomach painfully twisted into a tight, anxious knot as I slowly reached out and carefully picked up the electronic device. I physically braced myself for his extreme, unpredictable anger. I hesitantly opened the text message, my incredibly tired eyes quickly scanning the softly glowing text. Tyler had miraculously replied almost instantly. His written response read, "Oh no, Dad. Please rest and stay completely safe. Rachel and I are here cleaning the house for you. We love you so incredibly much. Let us know if you absolutely need anything at all." I stared blankly at the deceitfully shining words. The absolute sickening sweetness of his cheerful message contrasted horrifically with the dark, murderous truth I now intimately knew. They were not cleaning the house out of deep, genuine love. They were happily preparing my permanent subterranean prison cell. I took another long, shuddering breath and slowly set the buzzing phone firmly back down on the cold nightstand, absolutely terrified of tomorrow. The rest of the night dragged on in slow, suffocating hours. I sat rigidly on the edge of that lumpy, stained mattress, listening to the erratic buzzing of the neon vacancy sign outside the window. Sleep was an absolute impossibility. Every time I closed my exhausted eyes, the horrifying images of the heavy steel door and the amber bottle flashed across my mind. I was trapped in a waking nightmare surrounded by invisible enemies who wore the trusted faces of my own family. But as the freezing darkness gave way to the pale dawn, a profound psychological shift began to take place within my core. The shattered, grieving father who wept for his lost wife receded into the shadows. In his place, a much colder persona stepped forward to take the heavy reins. I was Rick Vance, the ruthless, calculating chief executive officer who aggressively built a massive real estate empire from nothing. I survived brutal economic recessions, crushed hostile corporate takeovers, and outsmarted the most cunning businessmen in the state. I did not build my vast fortune by being a naive victim. I built it by being undeniably smarter and infinitely more observant than anyone else in the boardroom. I forced my racing mind to compartmentalize the emotional betrayal. I treated this terrifying situation exactly like a hostile corporate infiltration. I needed to meticulously review the raw data, analyze the hidden variables, and establish an operational timeline. Sitting in the sterile chill of the motel room, I began to rapidly connect the scattered dots I had previously ignored through the blinding haze of my grief. My mind instantly locked onto the first major anomaly. Our family dog, a gentle, loyal golden retriever named Barnaby. Since Carolyn passed away, Barnaby had been my constant, comforting shadow. He was always affectionate toward everyone. But over the last 2 weeks, his behavior toward Stephanie changed drastically. Whenever she entered the main living room carrying my spiked morning coffee, Barnaby would immediately retreat to the far corner of the space. The fur on his golden back would stand up, and he would let out a low growl from deep within his chest. I had foolishly chided the dog, assuming he was simply feeding off my depressive energy. But animals possess an uncanny instinctual ability to sense malice. Barnaby knew Stephanie was bringing poison into my home, and he was desperately trying to warn me before it was too late. The second glaring anomaly struck me with the force of a physical blow. Just 5 days ago, I tried to access the internet on my personal tablet to review some financial emails. The digital device stubbornly refused to connect, displaying an error message stating the wireless network credentials were automatically rejected. When I asked Tyler about the sudden connectivity issue, he smoothly claimed the internet service provider had forcibly performed a mandatory security upgrade on our main network router. He quickly typed a new alphanumeric password into my tablet, patted my shoulder, and cheerfully told me not to worry my tired head about technical details. At the time, I simply thanked him for his assistance. But now, viewing the event through the cold, unforgiving lens of a hostile takeover, the sinister truth was glaringly obvious. They had deliberately changed the primary network password to digitally isolate me. They were meticulously controlling my daily access to the outside world, actively monitoring my private communications, and ensuring I could not independently reach out to my external lawyers or financial advisors without their immediate real-time knowledge. They were systematically building a massive invisible digital wall right around my failing mind. The third and most damning piece of the puzzle lay securely locked inside my private downstairs study. My professional paranoia always dictated that I keep my most sensitive financial documents physically secured in a heavy fireproof filing cabinet. That cabinet required a unique brass key that never left my keychain. It contained the confidential, organized, thick red folders detailing the exact legal structure of my massive wealth. I own 6 premium high-rises located directly in the lucrative heart of downtown Chicago. These magnificent buildings generate a continuous, massive river of passive income. But more importantly, the folders contained the intricate, ironclad legal framework of my $45 million trust fund. I specifically designed that comprehensive trust to completely bypass the slow probate process upon my eventual death. Last week, when I briefly opened the secure cabinet to file a minor tax receipt, I subconsciously noticed that the heavy red folders were slightly misaligned. They were pushed roughly half an inch to the left, and the chronological tabs were no longer perfectly sequential. I dismissed it as my own mistake. But my brilliant engineering mind never makes careless filing mistakes. Tyler somehow managed to secretly copy my brass key. He successfully breached my inner sanctuary and thoroughly photographed every single page of my private financial architecture. I stood up from the creaking bed and began to pace the length of the motel room, my heavy boots thudding softly against the stained carpet. I mentally reviewed the complex structural rules governing my massive estate. I had specifically instituted incredibly aggressive penalizing clauses regarding inheritance taxes. If I were to suddenly die under unexpected or highly suspicious circumstances, the strict legal provisions within the trust would automatically trigger a massive immediate liquidation protocol. The vast majority of my liquid capital and prime commercial assets would be heavily taxed by the federal government, and the remaining significantly depleted funds would be permanently locked in a rigid, heavily restricted corporate holding account for a mandatory period of 10 full years. Tyler desperately needed an immediate massive injection of liquid cash to rapidly pay off his mounting disastrous cryptocurrency debts. If I simply dropped dead from a sudden heart attack, he would be forced to wait a full decade to access a severely reduced fraction of the estate. I stopped pacing, my breath catching sharply in my freezing throat as the horrifying epiphany finally crystallized in my racing mind. The heavy steel door, the daily chemical drops, the manufactured diagnosis of rapid cognitive decline. If Tyler and Stephanie merely wanted me gone, they could have easily slipped a lethal overdose of that synthetic tranquilizer into my evening tea. I would have quietly slipped into a peaceful sleep and never woken up. But a dead man instantly triggers aggressive lawyers' meticulous federal tax audits and rigid, unbreakable inheritance delays. A living man, however, is an entirely different financial entity. If I am still physically breathing, but legally declared completely mentally incompetent by a heavily compensated corrupt physician, the restrictive death clauses in the trust are never successfully triggered. If Tyler secures my signature on a final power of attorney document, while I am still technically alive, he immediately gains unchecked legal control over every single penny of my $45 million empire. He can legally liquidate the commercial high-rises, drain the massive cash reserves, and seamlessly transfer the vast wealth into his own private offshore accounts without triggering a single federal alarm. That is exactly why they desperately need my aging mind completely destroyed while meticulously keeping my physical body alive. The bleak morning light slowly crept through the gaps in the heavy smoke-stained curtains of the cheap motel room. I had not slept a single minute. My mind had been relentlessly racing, meticulously constructing a flawless counteroffensive strategy. The profound grief that had heavily clouded my judgment for the past several months was completely gone, entirely replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I was no longer a vulnerable mourning widower. I was the ruthless chief executive officer who had successfully built a massive commercial real estate empire from the ground up, and I was actively preparing for the most important hostile takeover of my entire life. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the flimsy wooden door quietly clicked open. Malik slipped inside the cramped room, bringing a blast of freezing winter air with him. He had left silently an hour earlier, executing the very first step of my newly formed tactical plan. He walked over to the scratched nightstand and carefully set down a small generic plastic shopping bag. Inside was a cheap prepaid cellular device commonly known as a burner phone, purchased entirely with untraceable cash at a local 24-hour convenience store. I thanked him with a brief silent nod. I carefully unboxed the cheap plastic device, my mind already rehearsing the precise operational protocol I needed to follow. I could not risk using my primary smartphone for any sensitive communications. If Tyler and Stephanie were aggressively monitoring my internet network and digitally isolating me from the outside world, it was highly probable that they had also installed sophisticated tracking software directly onto my personal phone. I powered on the untraceable device, listening to the generic startup chime echoing softly in the bleak room. I needed to immediately contact Howard Beck. Howard was not just my primary estate lawyer. He was my oldest, most trusted confidant in the cutthroat corporate world. We had successfully navigated dozens of brutal financial wars together over the past 3 decades. He personally drafted the intricate, heavily armored legal framework of my massive $45 million trust fund. If anyone could accurately confirm the precise nature of Tyler's insidious financial maneuvering, it was Howard. However, I had to proceed with absolute, unwavering caution. I could not simply call his main office line and casually chat about my treacherous son. If Tyler had boldly manipulated my private passwords and confidently replaced my home security protocols, I had to operate under the strict assumption that he might have also compromised my traditional lines of communication with my own legal team. I slowly dialed Howard's direct, unlisted personal number from memory. My hands were perfectly steady now. The debilitating drug-induced tremors had completely subsided after 24 hours without Dr. Harrison's toxic mind-altering chemical drops. The phone rang 3 times before a deep, familiar voice answered the line with a standard, cautious greeting. I did not immediately identify myself. Instead, I leaned forward on the edge of the sagging mattress and deliberately utilized a specific, highly confidential phrase we had exclusively used during a massive, incredibly volatile corporate acquisition back in the late 90s. I spoke in a low, measured tone, stating that the structural integrity of the Southside Development Project was showing unexpected signs of severe foundational stress, and we urgently needed to verify the primary load-bearing calculations before the market opened. There was a sharp, sudden intake of breath on the other end of the line. Howard instantly recognized my voice, and he immediately understood the profound gravity of the old code. He knew this phrase strictly meant my current communication channel was potentially compromised, that I was operating entirely off the grid, and that we needed to speak with absolute, unparalleled operational security. Howard did not miss a single beat. He seamlessly mirrored my serious, professional tone. He calmly replied that he was stepping away from his open desk and transitioning to a fully encrypted, isolated landline located in his private, soundproof conference room. He instructed me to hold for exactly 60 seconds. I sat in the dim motel room watching Malik quietly stand guard by the locked door, his military instincts keeping him perfectly alert. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Finally, a sharp click echoed through the cheap speaker of the burner phone, followed by Howard's hushed, urgent voice. He firmly assured me that the line was now completely secure and totally isolated from the firm's main recording servers. He nervously asked me what on earth was happening, his voice laced with genuine, deep concern. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries or emotional explanations. I maintained my cold, executive demeanor, knowing that any display of raw panic would simply waste precious tactical time. I asked him a single direct question. I demanded to know if my son Tyler had independently contacted the legal firm at any point during the last 14 days. I heard the heavy leather of Howard's expensive desk chair loudly creak through the encrypted connection. The sudden, incredibly heavy silence that followed my blunt question was more terrifying than any loud physical threat could ever be. Howard let out a long, deeply troubled sigh, a sound of a man slowly piecing together a very dark puzzle. He cautiously confirmed my absolute worst suspicions. He revealed that Tyler and his wife Stephanie had indeed come directly into his private office just 3 days ago. Howard explained that they had bypassed all my standard executive protocols, aggressively insisting on an urgent, completely unannounced, and highly confidential meeting. They had convincingly claimed that my profound grief was rapidly deteriorating my physical health, forcing me to remain completely bedridden at the massive estate. They played the roles of the deeply concerned, loving children, perfectly, expertly weaponizing my tragic loss to successfully gain Howard's immediate sympathy. My grip tightened around the cheap plastic phone until my aging knuckles turned completely white. I coldly commanded Howard to tell me exactly what specific confidential documents they had desperately requested to personally review. I needed to understand the exact shape of the cold legal blade they were secretly sharpening to forcefully press against my vulnerable throat. Howard began typing rapidly on his secure terminal, the sharp clacking of the heavy mechanical keys echoing loudly in my right ear. He stated that they had completely ignored my expansive commercial real estate portfolio and entirely bypassed the traditional inheritance tax structures. They were intensely aggressively focused on one singular, very specific legal contingency hidden deep within my massive $45 million trust fund. Howard stopped typing immediately, and I could vividly hear the absolute unadulterated shock suddenly drain the comforting warmth from his professional voice. He slowly read the specific digital file name they had demanded to heavily scrutinize in his office. It was called the Incapacitation Transfer of Power. My blood ran completely cold in my veins. Tyler was absolutely not just casually asking about the final details of my eventual will. He was meticulously asking how to rapidly and permanently gain total unchecked control of the entire financial empire if I was officially declared legally incompetent by a highly corrupt, fully licensed medical physician. The heavy silence on the encrypted phone line felt like a physical weight crushing my lungs. Howard Beck, a man who had fearlessly faced down the most ruthless corporate predators in Chicago, sounded genuinely shaken to his core. He slowly repeated the title of the legal document, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. The Incapacitation Transfer of Power. It was a highly obscure, specific contingency clause that we had buried deep within the pages of my original trust documents nearly a decade ago. I had forgotten it even existed. I tightly gripped the cheap plastic phone, my knuckles turning white, as I demanded that Howard explain exactly what that clause allowed my son to do. Howard took a shaky breath, the rustling of thick paper echoing through the receiver. He began to break down the horrific financial reality with the precise, methodical delivery of a seasoned prosecutor outlining a massive fraud case. He explained that my $45 million estate was structured to protect my assets from frivolous lawsuits during my lifetime, but it possessed incredibly rigid protocols regarding my eventual death. If I were to suddenly die, my entire empire would automatically trigger a mandatory, inescapable 40% federal estate tax penalty. Furthermore, the massive probate process would instantly freeze every single liquid asset, commercial property, and private investment account for a minimum of 18 excruciating months. Tyler knew he could not afford to wait 18 months. His aggressive, ruthless cryptocurrency creditors were demanding their money immediately. If I simply dropped dead from a heart attack, the massive wealth he so desperately needed to cover his disastrous debts would be securely locked away behind an impenetrable wall of federal red tape. Howard continued his grim explanation, his voice dropping into a hushed whisper. He laid out the sinister brilliance of their dark conspiracy. He explained that if I did not die but was instead officially declared completely medically incapacitated by a licensed practicing physician, the rigid death clauses within the trust would remain entirely dormant. The 40% federal estate tax would never be triggered, and the lengthy probate freeze would be completely bypassed. By deliberately poisoning my aging brain with those synthetic tranquilizers and securing a fabricated diagnosis of early-onset dementia from their corrupt Dr. Tyler and Stephanie, were legally bypassing the federal government. Once that final medical declaration was officially stamped and signed, the incapacitation transfer of power clause would automatically activate. Tyler, acting as my primary legal caretaker and sole power of attorney, would instantly gain absolute, unchecked control over my entire $45 million fortune. He could freely bypass my corporate accountants and quietly liquidate the lucrative commercial high-rises in downtown Chicago. He could effortlessly drain the massive cash reserves and systematically funnel every single penny into untraceable offshore accounts, completely tax-free. Howard sounded physically sick as he outlined the flawless financial execution of their impending crime. He told me that my own son was converting me into a living ghost, actively erasing my vibrant mind while keeping my physical heart beating just long enough to quietly steal my lifetime of monumental success. The cold truth finally settled deep into my bones, completely, replacing my lingering grief with an absolute clarity. I sat on the edge of the stained mattress, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper of the motel room. I realized exactly how my own flesh and blood truly viewed me. To Tyler and his manipulative wife, I was no longer a human being. I was no longer a mourning husband, a loving father, or a respected patriarch. I was simply a breathing, fleshy vault holding their unearned money. I was nothing more than an inconvenient biological safe that stubbornly refused to open, so they had simply decided to melt down the internal lock using toxic chemicals. I thought about the endless decades I had spent aggressively building my vast empire from absolutely nothing. The thousands of sleepless nights, the missed family dinners, the relentless stress of managing massive commercial developments. I did it all to secure a flawless future for my beloved family. I wanted Tyler to never know the agonizing sting of real poverty. I gave him the finest private education, the most luxurious downtown condominium, and a life entirely free from financial struggle. My reward for all of that unconditional love and boundless generosity was a locked steel door in my own basement and a daily dose of debilitating poison slipped into my morning coffee. They did not care about my grief over losing Carolyn. They only cared about how quickly they could plunder the gold from my living corpse. Howard broke the heavy silence on the line, his professional composure completely unraveling. His voice cracked with genuine panic as he practically begged me to act immediately. He desperately told me that we needed to contact the federal authorities right this second. He offered to personally call the chief of police and dispatch a tactical unit to the estate to arrest Tyler and Stephanie for attempted murder and massive financial fraud. He insisted that we had enough circumstantial evidence to secure a warrant and rip them from the house before they could secure the final medical declaration. I listened to his frantic, highly emotional pleas, feeling the immense weight of the situation resting squarely on my shoulders. I took a very slow, deep breath, allowing my corporate survival instincts to completely take over the conversation. I tightened my grip on the small burner phone and spoke in a tone so cold and utterly devoid of emotion that it instantly silenced my frantic lawyer. I told him absolutely not. I explicitly forbade him from contacting the police, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or anyone else in his expansive legal network. Howard gasped in sheer disbelief, stuttering as he demanded to know why I would willingly delay their immediate arrest when my actual life was in such terrible imminent danger. I paced slowly across the dark motel room, my mind operating with lethal precision. I explained the fatal flaw in his strategy. I told Howard that if I called the police right now, I would destroy my only advantage. I had no definitive proof of their financial crime. I only had a short dashcam video and an unmarked plastic bottle. Tyler and Stephanie would simply show the responding officers Dr. Harrison's official medical diagnosis. They would smoothly claim that my wild, terrifying accusations were nothing more than the tragic, aggressive hallucinations of a sad old man rapidly deteriorating from severe dementia. The authorities would look at my documented medical history and instantly side with my loving, deeply concerned children. I would be permanently stripped of my legal rights and quietly locked in that padded basement before the sun went down. I stared at the blank wall, my jaw clenched with absolute resolve. I told Howard that we had to play their sick, twisted game to the very end. I could not just accuse them of planning a murder. I told him if I call the police now, they will claim I am hallucinating from the dementia. I need to catch them digging the grave. The heavy silence in the cheap motel room felt entirely different now. It was no longer the crushing weight of absolute despair, but the quiet, highly charged atmosphere of a tactical war room right before a major offensive. I had made my final decision. I was not going to let them simply lock me away in some dark basement and steal the massive legacy I had spent my entire life building. I turned to Malik, who had been standing quietly by the flimsy door all night long. I explained exactly what I needed to do. I told him I urgently needed reliable eyes and ears securely planted inside my own house. I needed undeniable concrete proof of their dark conspiracy before I formally brought the federal authorities into the picture. Malik nodded slowly, his extensive military background instantly taking over the complex logistics of the dangerous operation. He told me to wait in the room and keep the deadbolt locked tight. He slipped out into the freezing morning air, quietly tapping into his private reconnaissance network from his old days in the service. When he returned a few short hours later, he gently placed a small black canvas bag on the scratched wooden nightstand. Inside were 3 high-grade military specification microcameras and highly sensitive audio transmitters. They were incredibly small, absolutely no larger than a standard dark coat button, and completely wireless. He gave me a rapid, thorough tutorial on exactly how to properly mount them and how they would seamlessly transmit a secure, encrypted digital signal directly to the modified laptop safely hidden in his vehicle. It was early Sunday afternoon when Malik finally drove me back to the grand entrance of my sprawling estate. The sky was an overcast, depressing gray, perfectly matching the heavy dread constantly pooling in the bottom of my stomach. I explicitly asked Malik to park a few blocks down the quiet street, completely out of sight from the main estate windows. I urgently needed to walk the rest of the way entirely alone to make my meticulously crafted lie completely believable. As I slowly approached the towering wrought iron gates, I took a very long, incredibly deep breath. The raw, burning anger that had kept me awake all night had to be completely buried right now. I had to entirely suppress the ruthless, calculating chief executive officer and fully embrace the pathetic, rapidly deteriorating old man they so desperately wanted me to be. I deliberately hunched my broad shoulders, allowing my posture to dramatically sag with manufactured exhaustion. I forcefully made my feet shuffle awkwardly against the cold pavement, purposely dragging my expensive leather shoes, just enough to effectively mimic a severe, alarming loss of physical coordination and mental balance. When I finally pushed open the heavy mahogany front door, the warm, familiar air of my beautiful home washed over me, immediately followed by the loud sound of hurried footsteps echoing rapidly down the grand hallway. Tyler and Stephanie practically sprinted out of the east wing the exact second they heard the front door click shut. The profound psychological torture of having to look directly at their faces, knowing exactly what dark, murderous intentions lurked right behind their bright, welcoming smiles, was almost entirely unbearable. Every single instinct in my aging body screamed at me to violently grab my son by his expensive shirt collar and forcefully demand to know why my unconditional love was not enough for him. It took every ounce of monumental willpower I possessed to completely force my facial muscles into a confused, incredibly weary expression. Tyler reached me first. He grabbed my arms with a tight, desperate grip, his eyes wide with perfectly rehearsed panic. He frantically asked me where I had been, loudly complaining that they had been worried absolutely sick all night long. He falsely claimed he had been just moments away from dialing the local police to formally report me missing. I looked up at him intentionally, allowing my tired eyes to drift aimlessly past his face, carefully avoiding any direct, sharp contact. I raised a trembling hand and slowly rubbed my temples, perfectly mimicking a deep, confusing headache. I deliberately slurred my words, letting my sentences trail off into confused, disjointed mumbles. I quietly told him that the long evening shift at the medical center had been incredibly overwhelming. I softly mumbled that the bright fluorescent lights had unexpectedly caused a terrible dizzy spell, and my aging brain just felt far too heavy to properly navigate the dark winter roads. I weakly apologized for causing them any unnecessary distress, flawlessly playing the pathetic role of the burdensome, rapidly declining father. Stephanie immediately rushed forward, wrapping her arms tightly around my waist in a suffocating, deeply sickening embrace. Her expensive perfume filled my lungs, making me want to physically gag. She softly stroked my back, her voice dripping with artificial saccharine sweetness. She gently told me not to apologize, cheerfully cooing that they were just incredibly relieved I was finally home safe and sound. She carefully guided me away from the cold foyer and led me slowly into the plush, heavily decorated living room. She carefully lowered me onto the soft velvet sofa, treating me exactly like an incredibly fragile piece of antique glass that might shatter at any given moment. She knelt down right in front of me, placing her warm hands directly over my violently trembling ones. She looked up at me with those dark, calculating eyes, the exact same ruthless eyes I had watched through the dashcam footage as she coldly plotted my total cognitive destruction. She softly declared that I looked absolutely frozen to the bone. She cheerfully insisted that she was going to quickly brew me a fresh, steaming cup of my favorite herbal tea to properly warm me up and completely relax my deeply exhausted nerves. I nodded slowly, letting a vacant, appreciative smile softly touch the corners of my mouth. I watched her quickly disappear into the massive gourmet kitchen, my heart hammering, a frantic, terrifying rhythm fiercely against my ribs. I knew exactly what was going into that specific ceramic cup. She was actively preparing another heavy dose of the synthetic tranquilizer, eager to completely erase the lingering clarity from my mind and aggressively push me further down the dark, inescapable hole of their fabricated dementia. Tyler remained hovering nervously, anxiously pacing near the grand stone fireplace, occasionally glancing at his gold watch. A few short minutes later, Stephanie glided back into the space. She carried a delicate silver tray holding a beautifully painted porcelain teacup. She placed the shiny tray on the coffee table directly before me. She offered another sickeningly sweet smile, softly urging me to drink it while it was perfectly hot. I slowly reached out with shaking fingers, carefully lifting the cup. Suddenly, the brass front door knocker echoed loudly. Stephanie instinctively turned her head, annoyed by the unexpected interruption, while Tyler immediately walked away to answer it. In that split second, I swiftly poured the spiked tea into the deep soil of a large potted ficus plant, then pretended to take a long, satisfied sip from the completely empty cup. Stephanie turned back as I lowered the porcelain rim from my lips, letting out a soft sigh of contentment. I wiped my mouth with a trembling hand, ensuring my glazed eyes met hers with a look of manufactured gratitude. She smiled, stepping forward to retrieve the cup. She noted the herbal blend always worked wonders, oblivious to the fact that her poison was harmlessly soaking into the dark soil of the ficus plant behind the sofa. I nodded sluggishly, allowing my chin to droop. I muttered that I felt incredibly heavy, that the profound exhaustion was finally catching up with my fragile bones. I requested to be left alone for the evening, claiming I desperately needed a very long nap in the master suite to regain my fading strength. Tyler relaxed eagerly, agreeing. He ushered me toward the grand staircase, promising total silence. I shuffled up the carpeted steps, leaning heavily on the polished oak banister, counting every agonizing second until I was out of their malicious sight. I entered my master bedroom and gently pulled the heavy door shut, twisting the brass lock with a quiet click. The instant the latch engaged, the frail old man vanished entirely. I straightened my spine, rolling my stiff shoulders and taking a deep breath. The suffocating fog was gone, replaced by the razor-sharp focus of a man preparing to ruthlessly defend his empire. I reached into my trousers and pulled out the small black canvas pouch Malik had procured. I unzipped the fabric and carefully extracted the 3 high-grade military micro-cameras. They felt dense in my palm, tiny mechanical witnesses that would soon expose the darkest corners of this treacherous household. I slipped them securely into my breast pocket and moved toward the secondary door, connecting my suite to the private rear hallway. I opened the discreet panel and stepped out into the silent corridor. I knew every single inch of this massive estate. I had personally reviewed the architectural blueprints for months before pouring the foundation. I knew exactly which floorboards possessed a subtle creak and which marble tiles absorbed the impact of a stride. I moved through my home like a ghost, gliding seamlessly past the expensive artwork. My first critical target was the private study located at the far end of the eastern wing. This room held the fireproof filing cabinet containing the intricate legal structure of my $45 million trust fund. I slipped inside the quiet sanctuary and surveyed the space. I needed an optimal, unobstructed vantage point that would clearly capture the secure dial of the safe. I moved silently toward the tall oak bookshelves lining the adjacent wall. I reached up to the third shelf, shifting a thick, leather-bound encyclopedia just a fraction of an inch to the left. I pressed the adhesive backing of the first micro-camera directly into the dark recess of the wooden shelf, angling the tiny lens downward. It possessed a perfect sweeping view of the heavy steel cabinet. With the first trap armed, I silently exited the study and navigated the winding corridors toward the central spine of the house. My pulse quickened slightly as I approached the shadowed doorway leading directly down to the sprawling basement. I turned the final corner and stopped dead in my tracks. The standard wooden door that had hung there for decades was completely gone. In its place stood the horrific commercial-grade steel security door I had witnessed them unloading from the unmarked van. It was an absolute monstrosity of reinforced metal. The most alarming detail was not the thick steel itself. It was the sleek, modern digital keypad newly installed directly into the surrounding drywall. A glowing red indicator light pulsed softly in the dim hallway, aggressively signaling that the heavy magnetic locking mechanism was fully engaged. They genuinely believed a simple electronic barrier could keep me out of my own lower level. They had profoundly underestimated my deep, intimate knowledge of the property I built. As a seasoned commercial developer, I intimately understood the intricate electrical pathways threading through these walls. I knew exactly how the residential security grid was wired into the main breaker matrix. I silently crouched down to the pristine baseboard positioned just below the glowing digital keypad. Using a small flathead screwdriver I had retrieved from my bedroom utility drawer, I carefully pried the wooden trim away from the painted plaster. A complex bundle of colored wiring was neatly tucked inside the narrow wall cavity. I remembered the original electrical schematics perfectly. The primary security feed operated on a closed-loop circuit, but the secondary power line driving the magnetic seal required a constant flow of low-voltage electricity. I isolated the specific yellow wire responsible for the magnetic current. I pulled a small piece of exposed copper wire from my pocket, creating a rapid temporary bridge between the active terminal and the grounded neutral line. I pressed the copper bridge into place, effectively short-circuiting the magnetic seal without ever triggering the main security alarm panel. A soft click echoed through the quiet hallway as the massive steel bolts instantly retracted into the doorframe. The glowing red light on the keypad swiftly turned a vibrant green. I stood up, gripped the cold metal edge of the heavy door, and pulled it open just wide enough to slip my body inside. The air in the stairwell smelled sharply of wet concrete and fresh paint. I carefully pulled the heavy door shut behind me, leaving it resting slightly ajar so the magnetic lock would not permanently re-engage and trap me inside. I slowly descended the wooden stairs, my eyes adjusting to the heavy shadows pooling at the bottom. The open layout of my original basement had been completely destroyed. New cinder block walls had been hastily erected, aggressively carving the vast space into a tight, incredibly claustrophobic containment cell. I felt a cold shudder cascade down my spine as I observed the heavy soundproofing foam meticulously glued to the bare concrete walls. I reached the bottom of the stairs and crouched down in the pitch-black shadows directly beneath the wooden stairwell. This position offered a flawless, completely hidden view of the newly constructed prison cell and the heavy steel entrance door above. I retrieved the second military-grade microcamera. I peeled away the sticky backing and reached up, firmly pressing the tiny device against the rough, unfinished wood framing underneath the highest step. I checked the small indicator light on the side of the camera, ensuring it was actively transmitting a secure digital signal back to Malik's remote terminal. I placed my hand on the railing, preparing to ascend. Suddenly, a loud noise shattered the silence. I froze. The front door slammed shut. I heard heavy keys tossed onto the entryway table. Tyler's voice echoed through the ceiling. He was supposed to be in the east wing. I held my breath, pressing my back against the concrete wall. Rapid footsteps began moving across the hardwood floor above. The rhythmic thudding grew louder. He was heading straight down the central corridor, marching directly toward the basement door where I was trapped. Pure adrenaline flooded my aging veins, entirely overriding the deep, aching stiffness in my joints. I had mere seconds before the heavy steel door would swing open and completely expose my hidden position beneath the wooden stairs. I threw my body backward, scrambling desperately through the thick shadows toward the adjacent laundry utility room, located just past the newly erected cinder block walls. The heavy soles of my leather shoes scraped faintly against the cold concrete floor, but the sudden sharp click of the electronic keypad above perfectly masked the sound. I slid behind the massive industrial washing machine and pressed my spine flat against the freezing cinder block wall just as the thick steel door violently groaned open on its heavy hinges. The harsh, incredibly bright glare of the corridor light instantly flooded the darkened stairwell, cutting through the basement shadows like a physical blade. I held my breath until my lungs burned with agonizing heat, pressing myself so tightly against the cold metal of the washing machine that I could feel the steel biting deeply into my shoulder blades. Heavy, deliberate footsteps descended the wooden stairs. Tyler was moving slowly, his expensive shoes thudding rhythmically against the hollow treads. He paused at the bottom landing, his dark silhouette clearly visible against the stark residential lighting. I watched him through the narrow gap between the utility sink and the washing machine. He stood perfectly still for an agonizingly long minute, slowly sweeping his gaze across the newly constructed soundproofed prison cell. He was simply admiring his own treacherous handiwork, eagerly visualizing the exact moment he would finally lock me inside. Satisfied that his subterranean trap remained entirely undisturbed, he finally turned around and marched confidently back up the stairs. The heavy steel door slammed shut with a definitive ringing finality, and the magnetic lock engaged with a solid, echoing click. I waited in the pitch-black silence for 10 full minutes before I dared to slowly release my trapped breath. I carefully bypassed the electronic keypad once more, using my temporary copper wire bridge slipped quietly out of the basement and seamlessly vanished back into the sprawling, empty corridors of the massive estate. I retreated directly to the master suite and collapsed onto the edge of the large, unmade bed. My heart was frantically hammering a painful rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was operating with a cold, terrifying clarity. The physical infiltration was a complete success. The hidden micro-cameras were actively transmitting their encrypted signals directly to Malik's secure remote server. Now the absolute hardest part of my tactical counteroffensive had to officially begin. I had to willingly step out of the comforting shadows and perform flawlessly under the bright, unforgiving lights of the formal family dining room. I had to enthusiastically convince my ruthless captors that their insidious chemical warfare was working perfectly, that my brilliant mind was rapidly dissolving into a pathetic, disorganized mess. When the heavy antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, formally signaling the evening dinner hour, I slowly rose from the bed. I untucked the left side of my expensive dress shirt and left my top collar button completely unfastened. I forced my proud posture to droop, allowing my broad shoulders to sag with an invisible crushing weight. I shuffled slowly down the grand sweeping staircase, my hands trembling slightly as I forcefully gripped the polished oak banister for necessary physical support. Every single step felt like a deliberate, dangerous march directly into highly hostile enemy territory, requiring absolute mental discipline to actively prevent my raw, burning rage from violently breaking through my carefully constructed, fragile facade. The massive formal dining room was brilliantly illuminated by the glowing crystal chandelier hanging suspended from the vaulted ceiling. Tyler and Stephanie were already seated at the long mahogany table, chatting quietly. But the devastating sight that genuinely tore a massive bleeding hole directly through my hardened heart was my daughter, Rachel. She was sitting calmly to Tyler's right, casually sipping a glass of expensive red wine while scrolling lazily through her cellular phone. My sweet, beautiful Rachel. The little girl I had proudly carried on my shoulders through bustling city parks. The brilliant young woman whose incredibly expensive college tuition I had happily funded without a single second thought. The loyal daughter I had fiercely protected my entire life. Seeing her sitting there completely comfortable and undeniably complicit in this horrific, twisted nightmare was a profound psychological torture, far worse than any severe physical pain I had ever endured. I slowly shuffled to my designated seat at the head of the heavy wooden table. I did not verbally greet them. I simply stared blankly at the fine china plate resting directly in front of me, letting my lower jaw hang slightly slack. Stephanie immediately adopted her sickening, overly sweet caretaker persona. She gently asked if I was feeling any better after my long afternoon nap, her voice dripping with incredibly fake, manufactured sympathy. I did not answer her directly. I slowly reached for my heavy silver fork with violently shaking fingers. I allowed the expensive utensil to slip through my clumsy grasp. The heavy silver clattered loudly against the delicate china plate before violently bouncing off the table and hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp, ringing crash. The sudden noise caused an absolute suffocating silence to instantly fall over the dining room. I kept my eyes completely fixed on the blank wall located directly across from me, purposely maintaining a vacant, profoundly lost expression. I let out a short, confused whimper, perfectly selling the pathetic image of an aging man whose brain was rapidly misfiring. Tyler dramatically sighed a heavy sound of manufactured exhaustion, while Stephanie immediately reached out to comfortingly pat my trembling arm. I slowly turned my heavy head, my eyes drifting aimlessly past Stephanie and locking directly onto my daughter. I let a warm, highly confused smile slowly spread across my face. I looked directly into Rachel's eyes, and I intentionally called her by my deceased wife's name. I softly whispered, "Carolyn, you look absolutely beautiful tonight, my love." The psychological weight of uttering those specific words nearly broke my strict composure. Rachel visibly flinched, her dark eyes widening slightly as the horrific reality of my supposed mental collapse washed over the silent table. She quickly recovered her composure, her beautiful face hardening into a smooth, cold, unreadable mask as she gently corrected me softly, stating that she was Rachel, not Mom. The sheer agony of watching my little girl flawlessly play along with this incredibly dark abuse instead of desperately trying to help her failing father was absolutely excruciating. I slowly nodded, letting a single tear deliberately slide down my cheek as I intentionally dropped my white linen napkin. I slowly bent down completely under the heavy mahogany table to physically retrieve the fallen cloth. From that dark, entirely hidden angle beneath the table, I carefully looked up. I clearly caught Tyler, Rachel, and Stephanie exchanging a chilling, highly triumphant smirk. The dangerous trap was now working perfectly. The agonizing days that followed my terrifying realization at the dinner table required an unfathomable level of psychological endurance. I continued to play the pathetic role of the deteriorating patriarch, shuffling blindly through the massive corridors of my own home, willingly accepting the poisoned tea and secretly pouring it into the thirsty soil of the large potted plants scattered throughout the estate. By the time Wednesday morning finally arrived, I was completely prepared to execute the next critical phase of my counteroffensive. I slowly descended the grand staircase, carrying a small leather overnight bag, my shoulders deliberately slumped in absolute defeat. Tyler, Stephanie, and Rachel were gathered in the massive gourmet kitchen, quietly discussing their treacherous plans. I paused in the wide doorway, forcing my hands to tremble as I gently cleared my throat to announce my frail presence. I softly explained that the profound, overwhelming grief of losing Carolyn was becoming entirely too heavy for me to carry alone. I told them I had recently found a specialized grief support retreat located in the quiet mountains roughly 2 hours away, and I had officially registered for their intensive overnight program. I heavily emphasized that I desperately needed a temporary change of scenery to properly clear my rapidly failing mind. The sheer, unadulterated relief that instantly washed over their calculating faces was entirely unmistakable. Tyler swiftly stepped forward, placing a warm, reassuring hand on my shoulder, proudly praising my sudden, proactive approach to my mental health. Stephanie cheerfully packed me a small basket of fresh pastries for the long drive, her sweet voice hiding the venomous joy of having me out of the house. Rachel simply smiled softly, wishing me a safe journey. I weakly thanked them all, turned my back, and slowly walked out the front door, leaving the treacherous lions behind. I drove my heavy luxury sedan completely out of the exclusive neighborhood, taking a long, convoluted route to ensure I was absolutely not being followed. I eventually parked my vehicle behind a massive commercial shopping center and walked the remaining 3 miles through the freezing winter wind. I approached a large, unmarked black utility van discreetly parked in a forgotten residential alleyway, exactly 2 blocks from my sprawling estate. The heavy side door quietly slid open, and I quickly climbed inside the dark, incredibly cramped interior. Malik was sitting silently in front of a glowing bank of highly sophisticated digital monitors, his military-grade surveillance equipment actively capturing every single wireless frequency emitting from my home. The ambient temperature inside the dark van was bitterly cold, but I was entirely focused on the glowing screens illuminating Malik's hardened face. I settled into the rigid metal chair beside him, my eyes immediately locking onto the primary monitor, displaying the hidden camera feeds. The camera I had securely planted in the private study showed my heavy fireproof cabinet remaining completely undisturbed, but my attention was entirely focused on the secondary feed, the micro camera meticulously positioned directly beneath the wooden stairwell in the basement. The digital screen displayed nothing but a deep, impenetrable sea of pitch-black shadows. Malik silently handed me a pair of heavy noise-canceling headphones. I placed them over my ears, listening intently to the absolute silence of the dark subterranean space. We sat together in the freezing utility van for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the invisible enemy to finally make their move. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing electronic beep shattered the heavy silence in my headphones. Someone had successfully entered the correct security code into the brand-new digital keypad on the heavy steel door. A split second later, the massive lock disengaged with a loud, echoing clack. The heavy door groaned violently on its reinforced hinges, and a blinding flood of harsh artificial light instantly eradicated the basement shadows. I leaned closer to the glowing digital monitor, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs, as 2 familiar figures slowly descended the wooden stairs. Tyler and Stephanie walked confidently into the newly renovated space, their voices completely muffled by the incredibly thick soundproofing foam they had aggressively glued to every single concrete floor. The sheer absolute terror of witnessing a literal nightmare being systematically constructed inside the walls of my own home was profoundly paralyzing. This was the exact same open basement where I used to build massive toy train sets with Tyler when he was a little boy. This was the warm, comforting space where Carolyn used to happily wrap our Christmas presents every single December. Now staring through the cold, unforgiving lens of the hidden micro camera, all those beautiful, warm memories were violently obliterated by the horrific reality of their dark, murderous conspiracy. I watched my son proudly gesture around the confined room, completely admiring the sinister architectural modifications he had funded with my own stolen money. The sickening truth of their elaborate lies finally became undeniably visible. They had repeatedly told my loyal household staff that they were generously building a private, fully equipped rehabilitation gym to properly help me recover my fading physical strength. They had confidently ordered heavy equipment and massive medical crates under the absolute guise of loving proactive physical therapy. But as the high-definition camera slowly focused on the tight, deeply claustrophobic space, the terrifying reality of their true intentions became glaringly obvious. There were absolutely no free weights, no stationary bicycles, and no physical therapy mats anywhere in the room. It was not a rehabilitation gym. It was a completely soundproof, entirely windowless, padded cell. The new cinder block walls were completely covered in thick white industrial padding, designed specifically to absorb the frantic screams of a desperate man completely losing his mind. In the absolute center of the suffocating room sat a heavy institutional-grade medical bed. The thick steel rails on the sides of the mattress were deeply disturbing, but the most horrifying detail was the thick, dark leather restraint straps securely bolted to all four corners of the heavy metal frame. They were entirely prepared to physically bind me to that mattress, like a wild, rabid animal. Against the far wall, positioned directly beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, stood a tall, heavily reinforced medical biohazard cabinet. The thick glass doors were securely locked, but the high-definition camera lens clearly captured the terrifying contents neatly arranged on the metal shelves inside. The cabinet was absolutely filled with massive boxes of heavy mind-erasing sedatives, identical to the toxic chemical drops Stephanie had been secretly slipping into my morning coffee. Right next to the locked biohazard cabinet stood a tall, gleaming silver intravenous drip stand equipped with thick plastic tubing and sharp, sterile needles. They were not simply planning to hide me away from the world. They were actively preparing to permanently strap me to that heavy medical bed and continuously pump massive doses of destructive synthetic tranquilizers directly into my veins until my brain completely dissolved into absolute nothingness. I stared at the glowing monitor in the freezing van, finally understanding the true bottomless depth of my own child's pure, unadulterated evil. Malik reached across the cramped console and swiftly toggled the encrypted digital feed, expertly switching the primary transmission from the dark, horrifying basement to the hidden micro-camera I had meticulously planted inside my private study. The bright high-definition screen instantly flickered to life, illuminating the familiar rich mahogany walls of my inner sanctuary. The visual feed was perfectly clear, capturing a scene of absolute sickening jubilation. Tyler, Stephanie, and Rachel were comfortably gathered around my heavy oak desk, cheerfully holding expensive crystal glasses filled with my most exclusive vintage scotch. They were prematurely celebrating their impending victory. However, they were not alone in the room. A fourth figure was confidently leaning against the tall leather chair, holding his own drink with a relaxed, arrogant posture. It was Dr. Harrison. The highly respected, fully licensed private physician I had blindly trusted with my physical health for over a decade was standing in my study, actively participating in a celebratory toast to my orchestrated demise. I watched the digital monitor with a profound, icy numbness completely overtaking my physical body, my breath forming pale, freezing clouds in the dark utility van. They were casually laughing, the rich, warm sound of their shared amusement echoing sharply through the heavy military headphones pressed tightly against my ears. Seeing my children standing there so entirely relaxed and completely devoid of any basic human empathy was an incredibly devastating psychological blow. They were not simply greedy. They were entirely monstrous, calculating predators who viewed my entire life as nothing more than a temporary, inconvenient obstacle, standing firmly between them and a massive mountain of cold, unearned cash. Malik remained perfectly silent beside me, his jaw clenched as he respectfully witnessed the ultimate betrayal unfolding across the glowing digital monitors. The casual, conversational tone of the people I had loved and fiercely protected my entire life was far more terrifying than the stark padded cell waiting in the basement. I watched closely as Dr. Harrison slowly swirled the expensive amber liquid inside his crystal glass. He smiled broadly, his teeth flashing under the warm study lights, and raised his hand to formally quiet the jovial room. He praised Tyler and Stephanie for their flawless execution of the preliminary medication protocols. He clinically explained that the synthetic tranquilizers they had been secretly slipping into my daily tea had successfully deteriorated my cognitive resistance, perfectly priming my aging brain for the absolute final phase of their dark, murderous operation. The corrupt physician spoke with a sickening, practiced professionalism, detailing the destruction of a human mind as if he were simply reviewing a standard mundane financial spreadsheet. He proudly stated that my current state of profound confusion and deep emotional vulnerability was the exact calculated foundation they desperately needed. Tyler eagerly leaned forward, resting his elbows directly on my desk, his eyes shining with pure, unadulterated greed. He impatiently asked the doctor to explicitly confirm the operational timeline for the final transfer of power. Dr. Harrison offered a slow, deeply reassuring nod. He smoothly reached into his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a small, thick glass vial filled with a dark, cloudy liquid. He held the sinister vial up to the light, proudly presenting it to the eager room like a priceless, coveted trophy. I felt my stomach violently twist into a tight, agonizing knot as the doctor calmly began to outline the specific, horrifying mechanics of their ultimate endgame. Dr. Harrison set the glass vial carefully on the edge of the mahogany desk, letting his arrogant gaze slowly sweep across the faces of my treacherous children. He calmly stated that the final decisive action would officially commence this coming Friday night. He explained that the dark liquid inside the vial was a highly concentrated, incredibly potent, and totally untraceable synthetic hallucinogen. He instructed Stephanie to mix the entire massive dose directly into my evening meal. He described the impending psychological effects with a chilling clinical detachment. He casually noted that within exactly 20 minutes of ingestion, I would experience a total catastrophic break from reality. The intense chemical compound would violently induce a state of pure, unrelenting, delirious panic, trapping my mind inside a vivid, inescapable waking nightmare. I would be completely unable to rationally process my physical surroundings, utterly terrified of my own shadow, and desperately begging for any possible escape from the aggressive, terrifying hallucinations. It was in that exact moment of ultimate manufactured psychological terror that Tyler was instructed to aggressively step forward. Tyler would present himself as my only source of safety and immediate salvation. He would firmly place the heavy ironclad power of attorney documents directly in front of my violently shaking hands. Dr. Harrison confidently assured the smiling room that a man trapped in that level of chemically induced blinding panic would eagerly sign absolutely anything just to make the horrifying visions finally stop. Tyler would officially gain unchecked total legal control of my massive $45 million fortune in a single desperate stroke of an ink pen. The absolute magnitude of their sheer calculated cruelty was staggering. I watched my own flesh and blood enthusiastically nod in agreement to a plan designed to intentionally subject me to unimaginable psychological torture. I desperately searched the digital screen for any minor sign of hesitation or lingering moral conflict in my children's faces. I prayed to see even a tiny, fleeting shadow of basic human guilt. Instead, I saw only pure, monstrous anticipation. Rachel, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, the child I had always considered the gentle, compassionate heart of our entire family, slowly stepped forward. She gracefully lifted her crystal glass, taking a long, casual sip of the rich red wine. She looked directly at her older brother, her facial expression completely relaxed and completely devoid of any human soul. She softly smiled, her tone incredibly light and sickeningly conversational as she delivered the final fatal blow to my shattered spirit. She casually said, "Once he signs, we lock him down there. The massive drugs will severely accelerate his resting heart rate. Just bear with him in the dark basement for a few short months. When his aging heart finally gives out from the constant stress, we will throw a massive, incredibly beautiful funeral to perfectly keep up all the necessary public appearances." The silence in the freezing surveillance van became completely absolute. The agonizing words spoken by my little girl echoed relentlessly in my ears, systematically severing every single emotional tie that bound me to my treacherous offspring. They were not just stealing my vast financial wealth. They were actively, gleefully celebrating the violent, agonizing termination of my natural life. In that precise, horrifying fraction of a second, my heart finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The loving, protective father who had tirelessly provided for his ungrateful children officially died right there in the freezing darkness of the unmarked utility van. Only the ruthless, cold, calculating chief executive officer permanently remained. I would burn my empire to the ground, brick by heavy brick, rather than let them blindly inherit a single unearned dime. The final glorious war for my absolute survival had officially begun, and I would conquer them all. The freezing air inside the surveillance van felt sharp against my skin, but the burning heat radiating from my chest kept the cold entirely at bay. Malik sat silently beside me, his eyes locked on the glowing monitors that displayed the horrific dungeon my son had built. The absolute reality of their treacherous plan was now documented, undeniable, and utterly terrifying. But my mind was no longer clouded by the heavy, suffocating weight of parental grief. That fragile man was gone forever, completely replaced by the ruthless, calculating chief executive officer who had successfully conquered the commercial real estate world. I knew with absolute certainty that involving the local authorities was a monumental risk I could not afford to take. A standard police response would trigger a chaotic, unpredictable situation, and Tyler could easily manipulate a regular patrol officer with his fabricated medical reports and his polished, wealthy charm. I needed a flawless, overwhelming strike that would permanently eradicate their threat. I pulled out my burner phone and immediately dialed Howard Beck. I coldly instructed my seasoned lawyer to entirely bypass the local police precincts and reach directly into his extensive network of high-level federal contacts. Howard understood the immense gravity of my command. Within 2 short hours, a highly secure, heavily encrypted conference call was established. I found myself speaking directly to Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, a seasoned, fiercely intelligent detective operating out of the elite Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I did not waste a single second on emotional pleasantries. I spoke with the precise, methodical delivery of a man presenting a hostile corporate takeover. I systematically outlined the dark, murderous conspiracy my children had meticulously constructed. I detailed the unauthorized duplication of my highly sensitive financial keys, the systematic chemical poisoning, and the impending execution of the incapacitation transfer of power clause. Agent Jenkins remained entirely professional, but I could clearly hear the sharp intake of her breath when Malik successfully linked our live digital feed directly to her secure federal terminal. We showed her the horrifying high-definition footage of the soundproof padded cell hidden deep beneath my beautiful home. We clearly illuminated the heavy medical bed equipped with dark leather restraints, the tall intravenous drip stand, and the locked biohazard cabinet entirely filled with highly concentrated synthetic hallucinogens. The federal agent was absolutely silent for a long, heavy moment, before she officially declared that this was no longer a simple family dispute over a massive inheritance. She explicitly confirmed that my children had confidently crossed the line into severe federal territory. Agent Jenkins meticulously categorized their actions as a multi-million-dollar wire fraud conspiracy, aggravated attempted kidnapping, and severe federal extortion. The terrifying scope of their dark ambition had successfully handed me the exact legal weapons I needed to completely destroy their lives. A massive, highly coordinated federal sting operation was rapidly assembled over the next 48 hours. I sat in a sterile, secure briefing room at the federal headquarters, surrounded by grim tactical agents and forensic financial analysts. We meticulously reviewed every single detail of the impending ambush. I was no longer the targeted, vulnerable victim hopelessly wandering through a dark, confusing fog. I had smoothly, completely transitioned into the apex predator, patiently waiting in the tall grass for my greedy prey to blindly step right into the fatal snare. But the federal agents needed one final, undeniable piece of concrete physical evidence to secure a completely airtight, inescapable federal indictment against my son and his treacherous wife. The hidden cameras perfectly proved the existence of the horrific basement dungeon, but the prosecutors desperately needed to catch them actively executing the physical crime. Agent Jenkins looked me directly in the eyes and explained the incredibly dangerous, completely essential final phase of our aggressive counteroffensive. I had to willingly walk right back into the lion's den on Friday night. I had to play my pathetic, deteriorating role with absolute, unwavering perfection. I needed to intentionally provoke their manufactured endgame, willingly walking into their trap, so the federal government could slam the heavy steel door entirely shut behind them. I had to get them to physically produce the forged power of attorney documents and the dark glass vial of hallucinogenic poison directly on camera. To ensure my absolute physical safety and to capture their malicious whispered confessions, I agreed to wear a highly advanced microscopic audio wire meticulously taped directly to my bare chest. The heavy psychological weight of what I was about to do pressed firmly against my shoulders, but my absolute resolve never wavered for a single fraction of a second. I was about to look my own flesh and blood directly in the eyes and actively encourage them to commit a federal crime that would send them to a brutal maximum security prison for the rest of their natural lives. The loving father who used to read them bedtime stories was truly dead, leaving only a cold, calculating machine entirely focused on absolute survival and total retaliation. The remainder of the week passed with an agonizing, suffocating slowness. I flawlessly maintained my deceitful performance, shuffling aimlessly through the massive estate, intentionally slurring my words and constantly complaining of deep, confusing mental fogs. I silently watched Tyler and Stephanie exchange highly triumphant, secretive smirks whenever they thought my glazed eyes were looking the other way. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, dark void where my paternal love used to reside. Finally, the sun began to slowly set on Friday evening, casting long, dark shadows entirely across the manicured lawns of my sprawling suburban estate. The highly anticipated moment of absolute reckoning had officially arrived. I drove my heavy luxury sedan slowly down the quiet, familiar street, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel with a steady, unwavering force. I gently pulled my vehicle directly into the massive circular driveway, placing the transmission into park. Exactly 2 blocks down the dark, freezing street, Malik was parked silently in the unmarked tactical utility van. He was sitting shoulder to shoulder with Detective Sarah Jenkins and a heavily armed, highly trained federal extraction team. They were actively monitoring my encrypted audio wire, patiently waiting for my predetermined distress signal to violently breach the heavy mahogany doors and flood the property. I sat alone in the quiet, perfectly climate-controlled interior of my expensive car for one final, silent minute. I closed my eyes and took a very long, incredibly deep breath, letting the freezing, calculated energy of the ruthless executive completely wash over my aging bones. I stepped out into the bitter winter night, the freezing wind sharply biting my cheeks. I slowly walked up the grand stone steps, deliberately dragging my heavy leather shoes against the cold pavement. I reached out with a steady, determined hand and grasped the polished brass handle of the heavy front door. I pushed the heavy wood open, stepping completely out of the freezing darkness and walking boldly directly into their waiting, murderous ambush. The tactical agents were standing strictly by, prepared to immediately storm the massive house. I was absolutely ready to finally finish this dark, twisted nightmare once and for all. I stepped through the heavy mahogany front door, letting it close behind me with a soft, definitive click that echoed through the vast, silent foyer. The familiar scent of polished wood and expensive floral arrangements hung heavily in the air, but the atmosphere felt entirely different tonight. It was thick, electric, and vibrating with an unseen, predatory malice. My heavy leather shoes moved across the imported marble tiles, and with every single step I could feel the cold, rigid shape of the microscopic audio wire securely taped against my bare chest. It was my hidden shield, a silent mechanical witness actively transmitting every ragged breath and muffled footstep directly to Detective Jenkins and her heavily armed extraction team waiting just outside. I forced my spine to curve, adopting the pathetic, hunched posture of a thoroughly defeated man. I let my shoulders sag beneath an invisible, crushing weight, intentionally shuffling my feet as I approached the closed double doors of my private study. The warm golden light spilling from beneath the heavy wooden threshold looked deceptively inviting, a perfectly manufactured illusion designed to hide the horrific reality waiting just on the other side. I reached out with a violently trembling hand, turned the polished brass knob, and slowly pushed the door open to face my executioners. The scene inside my study was a sickening masterpiece of calculated predatory staging. Tyler was standing confidently behind my massive oak desk, his expensive tailored suit practically radiating a sense of unearned authority and arrogant triumph. Stephanie was perched gracefully on the edge of the leather sofa, her legs elegantly crossed, holding her glowing cellular phone up with both hands. She was pointing the camera lens directly at the doorway, her face twisted into a mask of sweet manufactured concern, entirely ready to record a beautiful, loving family moment for their fabricated legal defense. Rachel, my brilliant and utterly heartless daughter, stood casually by the fireplace, swirling a glass of rich red wine with a relaxed, sickeningly calm demeanor. And standing quietly in the shadowed corner of the room, partially obscured by the tall bookshelves, was Dr. Harrison. The corrupt physician held a sleek silver medical briefcase in his left hand, his eyes fixed on me with the cold, clinical detachment of a butcher evaluating a piece of meat. I paused in the doorway, letting my lower jaw hang slightly slack, intentionally projecting a look of profound, helpless confusion. Tyler immediately sprang into action, marching around the heavy desk with his arms wide open, exuding a toxic, suffocating warmth. He gently guided me toward the plush leather chair positioned directly in front of the desk, his hands gripping my shoulders with a firmness that felt dangerously close to a physical restraint. He softly guided me down into the seat, his voice dripping with an incredibly thick, nauseating layer of fake sympathy. He told me that they had been so deeply worried about me all day that my mental episodes were becoming entirely too severe and that they simply could not stand to watch me suffer anymore. He reached across the smooth mahogany surface and carefully pushed a thick, neatly aligned stack of legal documents directly toward me. The heavy black text glared up at me under the bright study lights. It was the absolute final surrender. Tyler gently tapped the signature line with a manicured finger, softly explaining that these were just standard medical proxy forms. He promised me, looking directly into my eyes without a single trace of hesitation or guilt, that signing these simple papers was absolutely for my own good. He swore that it would finally allow them to provide me with the round-the-clock professional medical care I desperately needed to find some lasting peace. I slowly raised my head, letting my glazed, unfocused gaze wander across the room. Stephanie adjusted the angle of her cellular phone, making absolutely sure the camera captured my pathetic, deteriorating state. She cooed softly from the sofa, encouraging me to just sign the papers so I could finally go downstairs and get some proper rest. In the dark corner of the room, Dr. Harrison silently unlatched his silver medical briefcase. The sharp metallic click of the latch was incredibly loud in the tense silence of the study. I watched out of the corner of my eye as he methodically extracted a long, clear plastic syringe and a small, thick glass vial filled with a dark, cloudy liquid. He slowly inserted the sharp steel needle into the rubber stopper, pulling back the plunger to silently draw the highly concentrated mind-erasing synthetic hallucinogen into the chamber. The agonizing tension in the room was entirely suffocating. They were all holding their collective breath, standing on the absolute precipice of claiming my entire $45 million empire. The complete absence of human empathy in my own children was a dark, bottomless void that threatened to swallow me whole. They were actively watching a man they believed to be completely broken, and they felt nothing but the thrilling, electric anticipation of extreme wealth. Tyler leaned closer, invading my personal space, his expensive cologne mixing with the sharp scent of his nervous sweat. He pressed a heavy gold fountain pen directly into my right hand. The smooth metal felt cold against my skin. I held the expensive pen over the thick stack of forged legal documents, allowing my hand to shake violently. The gold tip hovered mere millimeters above the crisp white paper, erratically moving over the dotted line. I deliberately dragged out the agonizing moment, letting them practically taste the victory, forcing them to clearly verbalize their dark intentions, while the microscopic wire recorded every single damning syllable. I weakly muttered that I was incredibly scared, that my mind felt completely dark and shattered, and that I just wanted to feel safe again in my own home. Tyler smiled a genuine, terrifying smirk of pure, predatory victory, and softly promised that everything would be perfectly fine the very second I put my name on that paper. Rachel took another casual sip of her wine, shifting her weight effortlessly, entirely bored by the pathetic final moments of her father's conscious life. The heavy, agonizing tension stretched for another 10 seconds. Then the fragile, terrified old man completely vanished from my body. I stopped trembling. The violent shaking in my right hand ceased, instantly replaced by a terrifying, rock-solid stillness. I slowly straightened my spine, pushing my broad shoulders back against the leather chair, entirely shedding the pathetic, slumping posture I had maintained for weeks. I slowly lifted my head, my eyes completely clear, razor-sharp and burning with a cold, unadulterated fury. I looked directly into Tyler's arrogant eyes. I threw the heavy pen at Tyler's chest. In a voice dripping with authority and absolute ice, I said, "Rest in the basement, tied to a medical bed with your toxic drugs pumping through my veins." The color instantly drained from their faces. Rachel dropped her glass. Dr. Harrison panicked, lunging forward with the sharp syringe raised like a desperate weapon. But the study doors were violently kicked open by armored FBI agents, completely securing the entire room. Absolute chaos instantly erupted within the lavish confines of my private study. Heavily armored federal agents flooded through the splintered wooden doors, their tactical weapons raised, and their voices booming with overwhelming, terrifying authority. Dr. Harrison did not even have a single fraction of a second to react. Two massive agents violently tackled the corrupt physician directly to the hardwood floor, knocking the lethal syringe from his treacherous grasp. The delicate glass vial of synthetic poison shattered violently against the marble fireplace hearth, spilling its dark, hallucinogenic contents across the expensive Persian rug. Tyler and Rachel were brutally shoved against the polished mahogany desk. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the room as their wrists were firmly locked behind their backs. The arrogant, untouchable heirs to my massive empire were instantly reduced to weeping, pathetic children. Tyler was frantically screaming, desperately begging me to quickly tell the federal agents that this was all just a massive, unfortunate misunderstanding. Rachel was sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect composure entirely shattered, pleading for a second chance. Stephanie desperately tried to distance herself from the catastrophic fallout. She shrieked wildly, aggressively, pointing her manicured finger directly at Tyler Oswald, claiming that he had forced her to participate in the sinister plot. The seasoned agents completely ignored her frantic, transparent lies and ruthlessly dragged her away in heavy chains. I stood tall and perfectly still, looking down at my kneeling, disgraced children with absolute icy detachment. The room finally fell into a tense, heavy silence as the federal agents secured the perimeter. I stepped closer to Tyler, letting my cold, authoritative gaze pierce directly through his pathetic facade. I delivered the final devastating blow with a remarkably calm, steady voice. I firmly told them that the $45 million trust fund they had so desperately tried to steal was entirely gone. I smoothly explained that Howard had successfully liquidated and permanently transferred every single financial asset to a highly secure, impenetrable charitable foundation early this morning. I looked directly into their terrified eyes and stated that they were entirely permanently cut off from my wealth. They would not receive a single dime to comfortably fund their luxurious, shallow lives behind thick iron bars. Their greedy tears were absolutely meaningless to me now. Several months later, the brutal wheels of federal justice finally crushed their remaining hopes. The overwhelming mountain of audio and visual evidence resulted in swift, merciless convictions. Tyler, Stephanie, Rachel, and Dr. Harrison all received decades in federal prison for their elaborate, murderous conspiracy. I actively watched their tearful, pathetic apologies during the sentencing, but my hardened heart remained completely unmoved. I immediately sold the massive, cursed mansion, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the dark, poisoned memories trapped inside those heavy walls. I utilized the vast remainder of my wealth to officially establish a massive, highly influential legal aid foundation, specifically designed to aggressively protect vulnerable victims of severe elder abuse. The massive organization rapidly became a nationwide beacon of hope, providing crucial resources and fierce legal representation for those who had been entirely abandoned by their own greedy families. I personally hired Malik as my permanent head of corporate security and my most trusted, loyal companion. The brilliant tactical expert had undeniably saved my life. The scene finally ends on a crisp, beautiful autumn morning. Malik and I are standing quietly together on the expansive balcony of my brand new downtown penthouse. We are peacefully sharing a hot cup of coffee, looking out over the magnificent, towering Chicago skyline. We watch the golden light reflect off the cold glass buildings, entirely free from the dangerous, toxic snare of the past. The morning sun warmly illuminates the bustling city below us, perfectly proving that shared blood absolutely does not make a family. I smile softly, knowing that I have finally found true peace and unshakable inner strength. True wealth is not measured by the numbers in your bank account, but by the integrity of the people you choose to keep in your life. Blood may make you relatives, but it does not guarantee loyalty, respect, or true love. When those closest to you show their true dark colors, you must have the courage to walk away and protect yourself. Never allow the fear of loneliness to keep you tethered to toxic relationships. The ultimate power belongs to those who can strip away illusions, rebuild their lives from scratch, and find genuine family in the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel today. Have you ever faced a heartbreaking family betrayal? Share your experiences in the comments below. Let us know where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Thank you.